So I'm going to call this a quick, hopefully, down and dirty intro to Redlands history. Now, when I say down and dirty, I'm not talking about the seedy underbelly. I'm going to leave that to Larry Burgess for some future time, but it's going to be quick, I hope, so that we can all have a little primer here on what's going on. Well, we can't start talking about Redlands history unless we talk about all the things that happened before Redlands too. And of course, our valley has been inhabited by people for many, 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 many years before European descended peoples came to what we now call the San Bernardino Valley. So here's, obviously this picture was not taken before European contact, but because there was no photography then. But these are actually some of the native peoples who lived in our valley and in our area in the late 19th century. And you're probably familiar with a little bit of the Redlands story already, I hope. This area out here was claimed by Mission San Gabriel. And here's a great portrait of the mission that was painted in 1832 by Ferdinand Depp. And you can sort of see the native peoples who were being converted, the missionaries in this kind of idyllic San Gabriel setting. Of course, it doesn't look like that today, right? It's all houses. But the mission's still there, so that's kind of interesting. Well, so this land was all claimed by Mission San Gabriel, and they were looking to establish a ranch outpost where they could raise cattle and find native peoples to convert to Catholicism and all of that. So they established an estancia. And the first estancia was out in present-day Loma Linda. This is an artist's conception of the second estancia, which I'll mention in a minute. But at that first one, the Franciscans decided that, you know, you got to go where the people are if you want to convert them. And there was a native encampment there called Wachama. And so that's where they decided to build this first estancia. One of the things that they wanted to do was also teach some form of agriculture, because this was not a kind of a crop raising in our sense that we have of raising crops. But of course they needed to have water. I love to use the quote that Carey McWilliams used in his book, Southern California, Country and Island on the Land, that he attributes to Mark Twain, that says, California is the only place you can jump into a river and come out all dusty. And unfortunately, I've never actually found the real attribution. So if anyone knows it, I'd be interested to know. Everyone who uses it cites Carey McWilliams, and Carey McWilliams didn't bother to footnote, which is unfortunate. But I like the quote, so I'm going to tell it anyway. Anyway, so out there in Loma Linda, now Larry Burgess says that I have stolen all of his best lines, and why not? Because they're great and they're fun to use. So one of the things that he did was quote a longtime professor at the university named Larry Nelson, who wrote in a paper about Redlands streets that place names are like children telling tales, artlessly blurting out the secrets of those who named them, which really means that you can learn a lot about the history and the background of a community or a region by looking at its place names. So if you are familiar with Loma Linda and are interested to know where the Wachama Rancheria was, just look for Mission Road. It's named that for a reason. They called it that because that's where this first mission outpost was. Back to the water thing though. So they realized that they needed to get a water supply to have this estancia be successful. So they dug what we in Redlands call the Sankey, S-A-N-K-E-Y is largely how locals pronounce it. Officially, it's called the Mill Creek Zanha, and there's a cutout of Mill Creek way on the other side of Mentone, and they dug in 18, 19, and 20 this irrigation ditch right into the ground, and it follows the contour of the topography all the way to this site along Mission Road, so the historic Mill Creek Zanha. And I'm going to show you, this is a map. This is from the early 1880s, but you can get a sense of the Sankey as it flowed because all of this line that meanders from right to left is the Zanha. And the reason it looks like that is because trees grow where water flows, and that's why it's completely tree-lined at this period of time. Here's a close-up, and you can see this is then the second estancia site. Today we call it the Asistencia. Asistencia is kind of like a submission. Our historic site was never at that level, but some boosterism in the early part of the 20th century decided to lift it to that level. That's a whole discussion for another day. But the second estancia site, that's where we call today's Asistencia. And it was located, of course, at present day Barton Road and Nevada Street. So by the middle of the 1830s, this site started in 1830, and then in about 1834, the Franciscans decided that maybe this wasn't such a great thing to be doing, because as it turns out, not all native peoples really wanted to be converted, and they made that feeling known. And about the same time is when Mexico was secularizing the properties that were owned by the Franciscan missions. And so the property was stripped from the missions. And about 1842 then, this guy, Antonio Maria Lugo, applies for a land grant from the governor of California named Alvarado, which very conveniently was his grandnephew. And they get the land grant for his sons, Jose del Carmen, Jose Maria, and Vicente Lugo, and then their nephew, Diego Sepulveda, which is a name that if you've ever been on the west side of Los Angeles, you've probably traveled on Sepulveda Boulevard, and yes, it's the same crowd. So they get the Rancho San Bernardino in 1842, and this is what it looks like. I have no idea how to read this map, but I think it's a cool map, and that's what it shows, the rancho. So they get it in about 1842 and start trying to build a colony here. The colony doesn't really work so well. They're raising a lot of cattle out here as well. And that brings me, time-wise, to our first poll. I've integrated a bunch of different polls in the program. So hopefully you will participate in that. If I can figure out exactly how to do it, let's see. Poll number 1. The city of San Bernardino was founded in 1810, true or false? So go ahead and add your vote on that. I'll give you about 30 seconds, and we'll see how it goes. Da-na-na. Pretty exciting. All right, everybody who wanted to vote already voted? I'll give you about 10 more seconds. How about that? All right. So let's see. We're going to share the results. 79% of you said it is true, and 21% of you said it is false. Okay. It is false. So you might have seen this sign, like if you go to Costco and you get off it at Tippecanoe, and this is right in the middle, you know, city of San Bernardino, California, founded in 1810. Except it's a whole bunch of baloney. The city of San Bernardino was not founded in 1810. It was founded in the early 1850s by a group of Mormon colonists who had come here from Utah to establish a new colony. And that is actually when the city of San Bernardino was founded. The story about 1810 didn't even come about until about 1902, when a priest in San Bernardino named Juan Caballeria wrote something he titled The History of San Bernardino Valley. And in it, he claims to have found documentation that said that a priest from Mission San Gabriel named Father Dumetz came out to the valley, and it happened to be May 20th, 1810, and proclaimed that because it was the feast day of Saint Bernardine, that this shall be, you know, forever named as as the San Bernardino Valley. Except that actual scholarship has indicated that either he was already dead at this point or so ill that there's no way he could have made this journey. So in reality, we don't know how the valley was named San Bernardino, but most definitely the city of San Bernardino was not founded until the early 1850s. So how about that? Okay, well, 1857 comes along, and there is a threat of war in Utah between the Mormons and the United States. And Brigham Young recalls as many as will come back, which means there's a fire sale on property. And this guy, Ben Barton, who is from South Carolina, he's already living in San Bernardino. He decides that this is a great time to buy property because it's at fire sale prices, and he gets a pretty good chunk of the Rancho San Bernardino that is now West Redlands, all the way into central Redlands, because it was using for sheep pastures and things like that. And in 1867, he built a house right next to the ruins of the Estancia. The house is still standing. It's the oldest brick structure in this part of the valley. Here you can see what little was left of the Estancia buildings, which were never really completed by 1834 when it was abandoned. And you can see the house. And of course, the house is still standing right there at Nevada Street. The Second Empire look that you see here was created in the early 1880s. I love the cupola tower on top. It also meant that the ruins out there were interesting places for people to discover and come out and see things. Well, a number of things were happening at the same period of time in the 1870s and 80s. One of the most important things that happened for the United States was the transcontinental railroads and the evolution of railroads. And so you can see here that by the 1870s, we had several different rail lines that served this part of the county. And the Santa Fe was in by the 1880s. The Southern Pacific came through in the 1870s. There were other lines that came in. Eventually they would come into Redlands proper. But what all of this travel meant is that people could come from all over the country and come by rail much more quickly than they ever could before, because before the only ways you could basically get to California, Southern California, were to get on a ship, take the perilous journey all the way around South America and hope you survived. You could get on a ship and go to the Isthmus of Panama and get off and then catch another ship on the other side and hope you survived. You could get on a ship and go to Nicaragua and go through Lake Nicaragua and then get on a ship on the other side and hope you survived. You can get in your covered wagon and come across the country and hope you survived. But now you could get on a train, and in a matter of a week, 10 days, you could be all the way from the East Coast to the West Coast, and it was an amazing thing. And of course, the railroads had all this property because of the system that the Congress sent up during the Lincoln administration to help finance these railroads. So they had all this land, and the best thing you can do once you put a railroad through it is then sell your land, because suddenly it's valuable because there's a railroad there. And they would push all kinds of land sales, cheap rail fares to bring you out, that kind of thing. So people started coming more and more to the East San Bernardino Valley because they'd read things like California for Health, Pleasure, and Residence by Charles Nordhoff, the grandfather of Mutiny on the Bounty, Charles Nordhoff, who was buried at Hillside, incidentally. And there were just all these promotional materials to bring people here. And if you are in, say, New Haven in January, February, or March, reading about California and the beautiful Mediterranean-like climate sounded pretty swell. So this was a good place to come. And for our part of the valley, the first little community that sprang up of people who had decided to settle out here was Ligonia. This is back to the place names are like children telling tales bit. Ligonia, they were looking back at history to find something meaningful for the name of their town. And they, of course, chose the Lugo family as the namesake for the community of Ligonia. So that starts in the 1870s. And this is from 1884. I just love this. This is from the library's collection because it's the last issue of the Ligonia Chronicle, where it says, died at the office of the Ligonia Chronicle, one paper of general neglect. Because by this time, Redlands was getting going. So two of the guys who came out from Connecticut, one by way of New York and San Francisco, the other more directly, were Ed Judson and Frank Brown. And they may or may not have known each other before they came to Southern California. We don't totally know. There's a story, which is probably not true, but I'm going to tell it anyway because I like it, which is that they were on the platform at Colton, waiting for a train, and a locomotive that was fired by coal belched out all kinds of smoke, and a cinder got caught in the eye of one of them, and the other, seeing the distress of the first, pulled out his handkerchief, and thus a great friendship was born. It's a great story. It's probably not true, but it's kind of fun. Okay, they first went into business together with a fruit dryer, and Frank Brown, having been a civil engineer, helped design some great equipment for that. One of the ways that fruit was dried at this period of time, because people were growing, things like apricot, deciduous fruits that had to be dried in order to ship because there wasn't refrigeration. And everyone who has, you know, an apricot or a plum tree or something like that knows that pretty much all the fruit gets ripe on the same day, and if you don't pick it right then it's on the ground the next. So if you're going to get your product to a market, you have to do it quickly, or you have to find out some other way. So drying fruit was the way to do that at this period of time. They went into business building a fruit dryer, and they would put big flats out in the sun, and the sun would do its magic, just like raisins are created today in the Central Valley of California by leaving them largely out in the sun for the sun to dehydrate them, which is why they're called sun-made, if you've ever thought about that. It's a play on sun-made, M-A-D-E and M-A-I-D, right? Because it's made in the sun. Anyway, I like to joke that because we have such winds in the fall in Southern California, that it was kind of like the big bad wolf came and it huffed and it puffed and it blew the fruit dryer away, something like that. They decided that that business was probably not the best business to be on, and they looked south of the Sankey because the Ligonia area was north of the Sankey, and said, well, maybe we could create another community south of the Zanha. And thus, the Redlands colony was born. They decided to become real estate developers, basically. And they're trying to think of the name, right? And you've probably all heard the story before, but say, oh, you know, what should we call our new town? And they say, oh, I don't know. And Ed Judson looks down, like kicks the ground or something, and there's a little cloud of dust, and says, well, maybe we should call it Redlands, because our clay is very rich in iron oxide, and so it has that reddish brown color. So thus Redlands got its name, right? So this is in 1881 they decide to do this. Things are going pretty well. They know that they have to figure out a way for people who are going to come see the land that's for sale to stay. So this is Prospect House. It is at today's Prospect Park. It's the first hotel in Redlands proper. You can see the woman, standing second from the right is Ellen Brown Seymour, who was Redlands' first physician, and she was also related to Frank Brown. And then when they're laying out the streets, you know, Frank Brown being a civil engineer, he has the background to do that. They lay it out, and this is that 1882 map I showed you earlier, but this is a close-up of where they thought that the center of town would be. So another one of those place names. They thought that the center of town would be on Center Street, and specifically Center and Cypress. Of course, that was not to be. Today, that's the location of Gerard's Market, but it was not ever the center of Redlands. At the same period of time, you know, agriculture is moving on, and Judson and Brown know that if they're going to have a real estate empire that survives, that they're going to have enough water for people to grow the things that they need to grow. So Frank Brown goes up at suggestion of others into the valley, Big Bear Valley, up in the San Bernardino Mountains, and he is able to use the magic of mathematics that is far beyond my ability, and calculate the amount of the volume of water that is claimed and the amount of water that is off to the ocean during the season as runoff, and then he's able to claim that water as a right and build a dam and store that water. So this is the dam while it was under construction at Bear Valley. Here it is completed. 2 years ago, when the drought was really heavy, I actually drove up into Big Bear, and this dam was visible because a new dam was created in 1912, which was much higher and drastically expanded the volume of water that could be stored. But the water level was so low from the drought that you could actually see the original dam. So it's still there. That was kind of cool. This brings us to our second poll while they're thinking about, now that they have water with the Big Bear Lake, how are they going to lay out the town? So here is poll number 2. And it is going to be, why do the streets in Redlands have oh, I misspelled 2, that's embarrassing. TWO, 2 different street grids. This is kind of like Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, right? So I'll say option A, so South Redlanders would never have the sun in their eyes on the streets. B, North Redlands streets follow Jefferson's 1785 grid oriented to the cardinal points of the compass, while South Redlands streets follow the Spanish law of the Indies. The third option, the surveyors in South Redlands were using a broken compass. Or the final option, the grid south of Citrus and Brookside Avenues is based on topography and accommodated irrigation and water runoff. All right, so what do people think? It's pretty exciting. About 5 more seconds if you're not sure. Okay. The correct answer is the fourth answer. The grid south of Brookside and Citrus follows the topography of the hillside. How about that? So that's why we have those funny intersections. They used to be funnier before the middle part of the 20th century reoriented a bunch of the places where the southern grid met the northern grid, making the weird triangular shapes. Probably the most obvious one left is next to the YMCA, where Olive Avenue comes to Citrus. Maybe that's the most obvious one. Okay, so streets all get laid out, things are happening. People are moving to our area, they're buying property, land is getting sold multiple times, and there's finally enough people here in 1888 that there's a big vote to incorporate as a city from the county. And the vote is successful in favor of incorporating as Redlands. At this time, it then absorbs all the area that was also called Lagonia. There had been bitter rivalry between these competing colonies for the period during the 1880s until the vote. And of course, there has continued to be rivalry over the last 130 years in some forms. But hurrah for the city of Redlands, the incorporation was carried by a rousing majority. So things are happening. Now it happens that several of the people who were colonists coming out and buying land from Judson and Brown settled in the eastern part of what is today Redlands. And they're the ones who helped decide where downtown Redlands finally ended up. So this is State Street, as it looked in 1887, soon after the streets were platted. And back to the place names thing, you know, this crowd, if you can guess, named their streets State, Wabash, LaSalle, Lincoln, Dearborn. And if you've ever been to Chicago, you will know that those are major Chicago street names and that this crowd actually came from Chicago out here. And if you've ever been in Chicago, I'm sure in January, February, or March, or maybe even into April, Southern California is a pretty swell place to be. So that's the first brick buildings going up in what would become downtown Redlands. This is the second floor on that bank building, which was the Union Bank. And here you see John Fisk, who was the first real estate agent in Redlands. He had the second floor office up in that Union Bank building. Incidentally, his home that he and his wife established on West Fern Avenue is actually now listed on the National Register of Historic Places, which is pretty exciting. Here's another view of early downtown Redlands. You see all the trees in the background, and you might be able to guess that that is where the Sankey flowed, because the kind of dividing line between the Lagonia area and the Redlands area was the Sankey. So that's where it was, and you actually literally had to cross a bridge for a while to go from one to the other. So this is about 5th Street, looking north and east. But things were getting really hot here by the 1890s. Things were going up. This is another view of State Street from the intersection at 4th, which is under today's Redlands Mall. But looking back, and the building with the cupola kind of in the middle is that same Union Bank building. So it's the intersection at State and Orange Streets at the northeast corner. Today, that's where Darby's American Cantina, I think is what it's called, is located. So just to get your bearings right there. So here's what that fruit drying looked like. This was the earliest kind of commercial agriculture that was going on. In addition to that, there were some other things that were happening in the 1880s, like winemaking. So this is pretty exciting. J.D.B. Stillman established his ranch out in the east of downtown part of Redlands, and one of the things he did was laid out a whole bunch of vineyard, and this is his winery building. And that brings us to our next poll. Let's see. It is What building at University of Redlands is located on the site of Stillman's Winery, because that is the area that became the university? So was it Larson Hall, the Administration Building, Willis Center, or Memorial Chapel? Da-na-na-na-na. I should record like the Jeopardy theme song. We can play it for Final Jeopardy, and we can listen to that for each of these. Maybe not? Okay. All right. Getting closer. Got a couple people probably left. Maybe you're on the fence. Okay, go ahead. 55, 56 seconds, 57. We'll do 2 more seconds and done. So this is how you voted. The majority of you said the Administration Building. The correct answer is Larson Hall, which started out as the library building on campus. But if you look in the photo, on the left side of the building, of the winery building, is J.D.B. Stillman's house, and that is the site of the Administration Building. So how about that? Okay, well, another big thing happens in the 1880s for Redlands, and that actually has its roots in, literally and figuratively, in Riverside. So you've probably heard the story about the Washington Navel Orange, so I'll try to make it really short, which is in the early 1870s, and it could have been 1872, 73, 74. Historians are a little bit in disagreement about what the date is exactly, but a dozen or so trees of this bizarre mutation of an orange were found in Bahia, Brazil, and they were shipped to the United States Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C. to study them. And they were great because they were seedless and they tasted good and they were easy to peel. And this woman named Eliza Tibbets, who had done a lot of interesting work actually in her life before coming to Riverside, knew this guy at the USDA and asked to have 2 of these trees shipped out to Riverside. And she planted them, and the story goes that she watered them, you know, meticulously with her dishwater every day, and they grew up, and they were an interesting novelty. So this is what's going on in the 1870s. And then someone sees them and realizes that, hey, this is more than a novelty. This is something that we can commercialize. But here's the only problem. The Washington Navel Orange doesn't have any seeds, or at least not any seeds that are viable. So they have to figure out how to take cuttings and graft it onto some other kind of citrus in order to make it grow. And if you've ever wondered how that grafting process looks for Washington Navel Oranges, check this out.
The young citrus trees receive as much care as the plants of a fine vineyard. Each citrus tree grows from 2 parts, the rootstock, which provides a hardy root system, and the bud, which determines the quality and quantity of the citrus harvest. The tiny creative centers hidden at the base of each leaf stem are selected by experts from the finest trees. These buds are placed inside the bark of young rootstocks. This will be an orange tree. Oranges, lemons, and grapefruit can be budded to the same rootstock. And if a rootstock should be budded with all 3, it will become a tree producing oranges, lemons, and grapefruit all at the same time. A pocket, like a kangaroo's pouch, all ready for the new baby. Nature takes over from here, and in a few weeks, look, this shoot will become the trunk of the full-grown tree. The rootstock above the bud has been broken so that the new shoot forms the upper part of the tree.
All right. The first guy who's credited with creating and planting an orange grove within the then city limits is this guy, Elon Waite. So he set out an orange grove. You've probably seen his house if you've driven around town, or if you've ever shopped at Gerard's, because it's actually the northwest corner at Center Street and Cypress Avenue. So it's still there, which is a very, very cool Victorian house. Here's one of those early citrus groves, and by the late 1880s and 1890s, turn of the century, this is what a lot of Redlands actually looked like. It was these baby trees growing. So You can imagine what it was like before. One of the great stories of citrus comes from David and Sarah Morey. Sarah Morey was a fantastic entrepreneur for that period of time, and she created a citrus nursery so that she could figure out how to graft these trees and then sell the little budded trees. And she was able to be successful enough that she sold $20,000 worth to Matthew Gage in Riverside, for whom the Gage Canal is named, if you've ever looked at Riverside history. And they built the dream house, which of course is what we call the Morey Mansion today. It's a great, beautiful place on Terracina Boulevard, and you can drive by, and it's one of truly the treasures of Redlands. Here's a look at Cypress Avenue as it was in 1891. This is actually taken from the tower of Kingsbury School, because it was a large brick building, actually, and they also called it the Kingsbury School, kind of like the Ohio State University. So the Kingsbury School, looking to the southwest. And the church that you kind of see off to the right is on Center Street at that time. That's the first location of the Episcopal Church in Redlands, before it moved to the current location on Fern Avenue. So if you could afford it, it was great to be a citrus rancher. And you could be a gentleman farmer out here. And one of the great advantages, if you had the money to start in the first place, is that you could buy a 10-acre parcel or so. You could build a little mansionette, and the citrus trees would pay for all of your upkeep and bring you a nice little profit and all of that. And so maybe you decide you can only spend 2 or 3 months of the year in Redlands, but you can have your little citrus grove, and it pays for all of your expenses. So that's pretty swell. We imagine that the kids sitting on the orange box in the center of this photograph are probably the kids of the family who own the Orange Ranch. But it became, obviously, as we all know, the most important thing in Redlands in terms of the economic drivers. And here's a citrus fair in 1891. I wish that this were in color, because I can only imagine what it might look like, because all of those little pieces of fruit in there are actual pieces of fruit. So you would probably have orange and grapefruit and lemons, and it would be a really stunning display. And in this particular one, they're honoring the Bear Valley Dam, what we call today Big Bear. And the orange industry remained the most important economic driver well into the early 1950s. And we went from having 20 some odd different packing house operations to now we're down to one today, and that's Redlands Foothill Groves, who's going to celebrate their centennial in 2024 coming up. Now, it wasn't always all about citrus. Joe Kubius tried for a while to raise olive trees and make olive oil and other olive products. So that was happening actually in Livonia part of Redlands for quite a while. All right, we'll progress a little bit more. Here's 1902. This is State and Orange Streets. We're looking, the bank building at the middle is the second major structure on that location. That's where the Union Bank was, that you saw, the very first brick building in Redlands. So that's where Darby's is today for your orientation. Orange Street's the one that goes off on the left side and State off on the right. And so this brings us to our next poll, just out of curiosity. Let's see. What was the population of Redlands around 1900? Do you think we had 400 people, or 1,000 people, or 4,000 people, or 10,000 people? All right, let's see how y'all did. If you answered 4,000, you are correct. So about that time, we had around 4,000 people. Los Angeles had around 100,000 people. How about that? But we're growing, because you can imagine we're only in the couple hundred in the 1880s, and suddenly we're up to 4,000 in a very short period of time. Okay, things are moving on. We're a real town, right? By this point, real towns have real great entertainment opportunities. And so a guy named Mead built this building, which is on the northeast corner at Citrus Avenue and Orange Street. And they were going to call it the Mead Opera House. And then the suggestion came because perhaps that was not a good enough, too pedestrian name. So the name Academy of Music was suggested, and that is how we have known that building ever since, because the second floor was the opera house with businesses on the ground floor. We get to the turn of the century, and we're really cooking with, I'd say steam, but in this case, we're cooking with electricity, because Redlands is one of the great places where alternating current was first being developed and generated off of Santa Ana and Mill Creek, Santa Ana River and Mill Creek. And so power was coming into town. And that was the predecessor of part of what became Southern California Edison, was the Redlands Light and Power Company. So by 1899, we went from having horse-drawn streetcars to electric streetcars. This is actually our Redlands Town Square. It's the intersection, where the funky intersection where Cajon Street and Orange Street and Citrus Avenue met. And that made this odd little triangle of land that they then called the triangle. So our town square was a triangle, and people would say, you know, meet me at the triangle, things like that. And it was there until the 1960s, when part of it became parking lot, and then it became the really stunning building that is part of Frontier now, but was the telephone company. But there, and you also see the big Liberty pole that was at the triangle as well. And now to our next pole. You know, the post office was a really important thing, still is a really important thing, but before they had home delivery, you actually had to go to the post office to pick up your mail. And so in 1903, this building was built downtown as the post office. On the third floor, there was a lodge hall and other offices on the second floor. But I'm curious if you know what is located today on the site of this building. Is it the Redlands Federal Citibank building on East State Street? Is it Ed Hales Park? Is it the Redlands Mall? Or is it Interstate 10? Dun, 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 dun. Ooh, this is a tricky one. All right, we'll give you a couple more seconds. Is this your final answer? Okay. The majority of you, 37%, I guess that's technically a plurality, not a majority, a plurality of you selected the Redlands Federal or Citibank building. The correct answer is Ed Hales Park. How about that? Right down at 5th and State. Okay. Well, you really knew Redlands was a going concern if you walked around downtown and you saw buildings like this, which was the first national bank of Redlands. We had several banks in town. This is now part of the beautiful Redlands Mall parking lot up from CVS, where right at the corner of Orange Street and State, which is the southwest corner there. And during this early period of time, you know, we had a national banking system, and the way that currency entered the market is that these national banks would get currency, and they would be minted with their own bank name on them. So several different banks in Redlands had these done. This is from the First National Bank of Redlands. These bills are quite collectible, of course, and we've got some great examples in the library's collection that you'll be able to see when the Redlands Museum becomes a reality very shortly. Well, it was more to Redlands than just the crowd growing oranges. There were all kinds of people who were living here. Redlands did have its own Chinatown because we had a decent population of Chinese men. Remember the Exclusion Acts from the 1880s and later prohibited immigration, so they couldn't bring women over to marry, so there were, you know, largely male-oriented communities here. What says Ligonia there is actually Eureka Street. So there was a little name change there at some point. So if you're thinking about streets, that is Eureka. And this is, of course, back to the place names thing. If you hadn't ever thought about it before, there is an intersection at Eureka that's called Oriental Street. And that little space in front of the buildings on in the Chinatown are actually where Oriental Street is today. And we had a Japanese population here as well. So the Oyama pool room served the men of the Japanese and Japanese American community that were here in Redlands in the early part of the century. Other kinds of businesses existed. B.S. Stevenson built a jewelry shop, which building still stands on North 5th Street, the block between Citrus and State. And at this period of time, there was actually a 3rd floor and the family lived above the jewelry store. When automobiles came along, it was great because we were right on the cutting edge, and Albert Osmond, who had come out as a young man, camped along the Sankey when he first arrived, an entrepreneur, went into business, did a number of different things, including working for the railroad on the little short line that went between Redlands and San Bernardino for many years. He also had an early automobile agency, and here is the Osmond Tourist Automobile Agency. Downtown Redlands by the 1920s, here we are from, about the Royal Falconer on the 2nd floor, looking to the north, that's Orange Street. And interestingly, right, just up to the right of center, this building there, that for many years was the location of Gerard's Market before it moved to its location on Cypress Avenue at center. Now, of course, we cannot talk about the history of Redlands without talking about these two guys right here, because they are, along with their co-Redlander early pioneers, helped establish a tradition of philanthropy and volunteerism that we still feel in this town today. And this is going to be another one of our great polls. Second to the last poll, I promise. So which Smiley brother is standing? Alfred, Daniel, Albert, or Giroux? Da-da-da. Give you a couple more seconds. Dun, dun, dun. All right. If you said Albert, and most of you did, you are correct. Fantastic job. Alfred is seated. And these identical twin brothers, who were actually born in Maine, good Quakers, had gone into education. Then later in their lives, kind of took a detour and went into hospitality and resort creation and management in New York State. And here is the Mohonk Mountain House. I guess I should close that. The original part of this was the Stokes Tavern, which is this little bit of, well, near the Stokes Tavern and the first rooms that were built right there. And it was so popular, it expanded many, many times until its most recent major expansion, which was in 1902. I'm sure a number of you have had the opportunity to visit Mohonk, which is still operated by the family. They talk about it being operated by the 5th generation. The way I think about it, because Daniel Smiley, the half-brother, was 30 years younger, that even though they were brothers, they were different generations, in which case the crowd now, which is Eric Gullickson and Tom Smiley, their cousins, operating the hotel, they would actually be like a 6th generation. And most businesses that are family run don't make it past the 2nd or 3rd. So this is a really remarkable story. Well, anyway, the Mountain House was closed during the winter time, and the boys, the twins, were getting up in their years, and they were looking around for places to spend their winters, because if you could afford to spend your winter not in a place that had winter, you did that. And they ended up coming to Southern California and selecting Redlands and began to build their estate here around 1890. And this is what it looked like. Today we call it Smiley Heights. So if you're familiar with that, This is actually taken from the window of the second story of Albert Smiley's house, a beautiful tourist postcard. And they had basically a 200-acre botanical park with thousands of species of plants and trees and shrubs and flowers. Of course, our growing season is the winter time, which is fantastic if you love the out of doors, which they did. Here they are standing in front of Albert Smiley's house. And they opened up their park to anyone who wanted to come visit. And that's really what absolutely put Redlands on the map, because thousands and thousands and thousands of people came to see Canyon Crest Park. But in addition to their park, you know, we are grateful for their philanthropic gifts. Probably most notably, certainly for me, is A.K. Smiley Public Library, the whole public library movement. And Alfred Smiley was actually one of the leaders of the public library movement in Redlands. And in 1894, he and others got the Redlands Public Library created, which was a single room reading room in the YMCA building that had just been finished at that time. And around 1897, he says to his brother, you know, the city's growing, won't you build us a library building? So Albert started buying up property and moving houses where he needed to, because he believed that there needed to be, in addition to a beautiful library building, a downtown park for people to enjoy, because there is much beauty in nature as there should be learning in books. And this was the result. 1898, it was dedicated and it was named in his honor. It was not his intention. It was supposed to be the Redlands Public Library, but the city council at that time believed that this gift was so important that they chose to name it in his honor. And not only did Albert Smiley, by borrowing money, incidentally, build the initial library building, he built the first major addition to the library, which is the reference wing. This is pretty much how the library looks today. And then many important people came to visit him while he was out here. Alfred sadly died in 1903, but Albert continued to come out for the winters. Here's his friend Andrew Carnegie, who many of you may have heard of before. And he visited Redlands May 19th of 1910. And this is a visit up at Albert Smiley's home. And no, he's not holding bocce balls. He's actually holding a couple of Redlands navel oranges. How about that? Incidentally, Carnegie, when he came to Smiley Library, said that that was the first time he'd ever been in a library that he hadn't given, but that people should not be honoring him that day. They should instead be honoring his friend Albert Smiley, because Carnegie himself only gave away the money he already had, but Albert Smiley went out and borrowed money to give his gift of love. And it's probably a philanthropic lesson that we could all learn from. When things are really meaningful, that we need to follow through and make sure that those things happen, even if it means leveraging or doing without ourselves. So what a great example Albert Smiley is for our community. Well, because of the Smileys and others of their time who were well connected, a number of very important people have visited town over the years. In 1901, President William McKinley came to Redlands and spoke from the Casa Loma Hotel. Theodore Roosevelt came in 1903 as president, and here he is on his tour around town, greeting Albert Smiley in Smiley Heights. Here we have William Howard Taft, who was visiting Redlands on his trip in 1909. And others were inspired in Redlands to do interesting things as well. The England family, for example, created another private park called Prospect Park. People came from all over the place to see Prospect Park, and it's one of the great success stories of Redlands philanthropy, in that in the 1960s, when this park was threatened with development, people of Redlands came together to save it from development and preserve it for all Redlanders to enjoy. And so today we can go and enjoy Prospect Park with our families because of the people and the vision of the 1960s. Oop. And now I'm going to go to my very last poll. Oops, if I can hit the right button. And after the orange crop, which of the following crops was the most important economic driver in early Redlands? The alfalfa crop, the tourist crop, the GIS crop, or the caracara crop? Oh, it looks like you guys are a pretty educated group here. That's excellent. Okay, Good job, everybody. It was absolutely the tourist crop, for sure. Tourism, the second most important economic driver in Redlands, because before there was a Palm Springs, snowbirds came to places like Redlands and Riverside. So here was the short-lived Teresina Hotel on Teresina Boulevard. It's a great hotel, was not doing so well and mysteriously burned down one night in the 1890s, and that's today a part of the parking lot for Redlands Community Hospital. The big tourist hotel Casa Loma on Colton Avenue at Orange Street was built in 1896 for these winter residents to come and visit Redlands. In the early 1930s, La Posada was built. I hear my clock striking, so we are almost finished. And then, of course, because it was so important, and in Redlands, we believe very strongly in making sure everyone sees us in quite the right way. Redlanders persuaded the Santa Fe Railway to build a brand new station. This was completed in 1910. It's undergoing a massive renovation, restoration right now. It's going to be unbelievably stunning when the new rail line comes in. And it was designed by the same firm that built San Francisco City Hall, if you're familiar with that. So that's pretty exciting. Arthur Brown Jr. came down. So only the best for sainted Redlands. And the kinds of things that helped the tourists come out here were the location on the Santa Fe Railway of their kite-shaped track, and you could read all about the importance of Redlands in their little brochures. Here's what the kite looked like as you would go around in their kind of figure 8 into town. We're on the east end there, of course. Then here we have the inside that talks about the wonders of Redlands. Southern Pacific Railroad was going to have their own thing too, so they called theirs the inside track, and we're the easternmost end of that line. You can see that on a map, and there's Smiley Heights right there, so they knew where they were going. Beautiful verbiage in town that describes it, and then the Burge Mansion in the photo right there in the center at the left. The electric railways were also serving Redlands from the great interurbans in Southern California, so here was Pacific Electric's answer to the tourist industry, the Orange Belt Special. You could come and then take a tally-ho over Smiley Heights. And they later named it the Orange Empire Trolley Trip. And it was so important that when Southern Pacific debuted the Golden State Limited service on December 31st, 1924, the train stopped in San Mateo Canyon, and the Redlands Chamber of Commerce had organized a whole meet and greet with this crowd to hear the wonders and get a whole packet of information and oranges. And here they are on the back of the train stopping in San Mateo Canyon. Pretty cool. And lastly, of course, there was also bus service. So a number of different ways that you can get to Redlands. And then I will close with one of the more remarkable things that came out of this same period of time, because Redlands was a very young town in 1907 when a group of people led by a Baptist minister named Jasper Newton Field decided that if Redlands was going to be a real place, it also needed a real university. And even though it was founded as an American Baptist college, people from all different religious backgrounds came together because they knew of the benefit of this town, of this university for their community, to found University of Redlands, which started there at the Acropolis on the top of the hill where J.D.B. Stillman's house had been constructed with the administration building in 1909. And that's as far as I'm going to take you today on this down and dirty quick. I really appreciate all of your time being here this morning. I know you've got a lot of choices of things to do, but Maria and Katie and I are grateful that you chose to spend your morning with us. If you are interested in learning more about the library and its services, remember that Smiley Library is open 24 hours a day online.